On July 4, 1862, a mathematics lecturer at Oxford rowed three young girls up the Thames and told them a story about a child who falls into a hole and never quite finds her way back to who she was before. The weather records from that afternoon described the day as cool and rather wet. The man who told the story would later insist it was golden. That man was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. The story became Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And the distance between the golden afternoon he remembered and the overcast sky that actually hung above the river is, in many ways, the entire subject of this essay. Because Alice in Wonderland is not what you were told it was. It is not a whimsical fairy tale. It is not a children's adventure. It is a meticulously coded document, written by a man with a fractured identity, set in a world modeled on industrial disease and political execution, and born from a relationship with a real child that has haunted literary scholarship for over a century and a half. This is the disturbing truth of Alice in Wonderland, and it begins not in a rabbit hole, but in a dark room. Act 1. The Man with Two Names. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson was born on January 27, 1832, in Daresbury, Cheshire, the eldest son in a family of 11 children. Every one of them stammered. The shared affliction turned the family inward. Dodgson became their primary entertainer, building marionette theaters and inventing word games to bridge the communicative gap that silence carved between them. He would carry that stammer his entire life, calling it his hesitation, and it would define his relationship with the adult world as one of perpetual discomfort. He arrived at Christ Church, Oxford, in 1851 and never left. 47 years, his entire adult existence confined within the same stone walls, the same quadrangles, the same hierarchy of dons and students and bells. The great Tom bell in the Tom Tower rang 101 times every night at 9:05 p.m., once for each of the original undergraduates, though because Oxford sits 5 minutes west of Greenwich, the actual local time was 9 o'clock. A preoccupation with clocks that are technically correct, but functionally misleading. If that detail sounds familiar, it should. It became the White Rabbit. Dodgson split himself in two. Under his birth name, he published rigorous work on Euclidean mathematics and symbolic logic. Under the pseudonym Lewis Carroll, a Latinate inversion, Charles becoming Carolus, Lutwidge becoming Ludovicus, he published what he called nonsense. His colleagues found him awkward, stiff, and unfriendly. His stammer made lecturing an agony and preaching a humiliation. But around children, specifically young girls, the stammer reportedly eased, the rigidity dissolved, and it was in this space, between the mathematician who could not speak to adults and the storyteller who came alive in the company of the very young, that Alice was born. Act 2. The Real Alice. In 1855, Henry George Liddell arrived as the new Dean of Christ Church, bringing with him 3 daughters, Lorena, Alice, and Edith. Dodgson met them while photographing the cathedral the following year, and what began as a neighborly acquaintance accelerated into something that biographers have struggled to define ever since. The word most commonly used is obsession, though the nature of that obsession remains a matter of fierce scholarly dispute. On July 4, 1862, Dodgson and Reverend Robinson Duckworth rowed the 3 Liddell sisters up the Thames to Godstow. To entertain them, Dodgson improvised a story in which each passenger became a character. Edith was the eaglet, Lorena was the lory, Duckworth was the duck, and Dodgson cast himself as the dodo, a creature defined by its own extinction. Alice Liddell, then 10 years old, was so captivated that she begged him to write the story down. He complied. The manuscript was called Alice's Adventures Underground, and it would become the most influential children's book in the English language. But here is what the golden afternoon conceals. Of Dodgson's 13 private journal volumes, 4 have vanished entirely. Several surviving pages have been physically cut from the binding with a razor. The most significant excision covers June 27th through 29th, 1863. the exact period of a sudden, permanent rupture between Dodgson and the Liddell family. One day, he was a fixture in their home. The next, he held aloof and was never welcomed back. What happened in those missing days has generated decades of competing theories. The biographer Morton N. Cohen proposed that Dodgson had attempted to arrange a marriage to Alice, who was 11 years old at the time, and that Mrs. Liddell banished him in horror. The researcher Caroline Leach later discovered a summary note in the family papers, written by Dodgson's niece, Violet, which suggests the confrontation was not about Alice at all, but about rumors that Dodgson was using the children as a pretext to court their governess, or that he had developed an attachment to the eldest sister, Lorena, who was 14. Jenny Wolfe added a third possibility, that Lorena had developed feelings for Dodgson, and the family removed the pages to protect her reputation. We do not know which version is true. What we know is that Mrs. Liddell subsequently destroyed every letter Dodgson had written to her children, every one, and that Dodgson, for the remaining 35 years of his life, never stopped photographing young girls. Act 3. The Photographs. Dodgson produced nearly 3,000 photographs in his lifetime. Many are portraits of children posed in elaborate costumes, what the Victorians called fancy dress. They were admired in their own era by figures as prominent as Tennyson. But a subset of these images, nude studies of young girls, conducted with parental consent, has become the fulcrum of the modern debate. Scholars like Douglas R. Nichol argue that the Victorian era viewed children as pre-sexual creatures, and that nude photography of minors was a recognized, if niche, artistic tradition. Within this framework, Dodgson's work was no more unusual than a painter sketching a cherub. And yet, his own diaries betray a man at war with himself. They are laced with what scholars describe as agonized prayers and episodes of intense self-recrimination, language that suggests a conscience grappling with impulses that even he could not fully articulate. The most debated image is the so-called beggar-maid photograph of Alice Liddell, taken in 1858. It shows the child in deliberately tattered clothes, her shoulder bare, her expression described by modern critics as strikingly modern, a gaze that simultaneously invites and unsettles. To Victorian eyes, this was sentimentality. To modern eyes, it reads as something far more uncomfortable. And here is where the scholarly record fractures. Those who defend Dodgson point to parental consent, artistic convention, and the absence of any accusation during his lifetime. Those who do not point to the razored diaries, the burned letters, and the documented pattern of a man whose primary emotional life was conducted in the company of children. Alice Liddell herself, as an adult, described Dodgson as the kindest friend a child could have. She also, in her later years, expressed an exhaustion with being defined by the story he had made of her, a weariness that suggests the golden afternoon cast a longer shadow than any fairy tale should. Act 4. The Violence Inside the Text. To read Alice's adventures in Wonderland as a children's story is to ignore what the text actually contains. The narrative is structured not as a fairy tale, but as a series of escalating encounters with cruelty, madness, and systemic violence, each one drawn directly from the Victorian world Dodgson inhabited. The Queen of Hearts is the text's most visible monster. Carroll himself described her as an embodiment of ungovernable passion, a blind and aimless fury. She orders decapitations for infractions as trivial as planting white roses instead of red. Historians read her as a composite, Queen Victoria satirized for her infamous temper, a reflection of Tudor despots like Henry VIII, and a direct reference to the Wars of the Roses, with the painting of white roses red literalizing the blood that marked the transition from York to Lancaster. But the Duchess's kitchen is worse. The air chokes with pepper. A cook hurls plates and pots at the Duchess and her infant. The Duchess recites a lullaby that instructs parents to speak roughly to your little boy and beat him when he sneezes. And then the baby transforms into a pig, a moment that scholars read as Carroll's cynical commentary on the trajectory of male childhood. Dodgson, who openly preferred the company of girls, wrote this transformation as a thesis. The innocent child will inevitably become the beastly adult. The cult of childhood was, for him, a countdown to its own destruction. And then there is the Mad Hatter. His madness is not whimsy. It is a clinical portrait of mercury poisoning, erethism, the occupational disease of Victorian hatmakers. The carroting process used mercury nitrate to separate fur from pelts, and prolonged exposure produced a constellation of symptoms that Carroll transcribed with medical precision: pathological shyness, alternating with explosive irritability, tremors so severe they were called Hatter's shakes, hallucinations, delirium, and the progressive erosion of memory and speech. The Mad Tea Party is not a surrealist joke. It is an industrial autopsy. The Hatter's inability to answer his own riddles, his fixation on a time that has stopped, his oscillation between aggression and vacancy, these are the documented symptoms of a man whose brain has been slowly dissolved by the tools of his trade. Even the mock turtle is a monument to class violence. Real green turtle soup was a luxury of the aristocracy. Mock turtle soup, made from calf heads, feet, and tails, was the imitation consumed by those who could not afford the original. Carroll drew the mock turtle as a grotesque hybrid, a creature with a calf's head and hooves grafted onto a turtle's body. His endless weeping and his mournful song about beautiful soup satirized the sentimentality of a lower middle class that tried to simulate wealth by consuming offal dressed in aspiration. Act 5. The World That Made the Book. None of this existed in isolation. Alice was written inside a society where 20% of children died before the age of 5, where 59% of deaths among those under 15 were infants, and where the leading killers were cholera, pneumonia, and the quiet suffocation of opium-dosed babies whose parents called the process shrinking up. 5 out of 6 families used opium or laudanum as a household remedy. The caterpillar smoking a hookah on a mushroom, the sensations of growing and shrinking, the dense dream logic of the narrative. These images existed within a culture where altered consciousness was not countercultural rebellion, but Tuesday afternoon. Before Alice, children's literature in England consisted almost entirely of morality tales, stories designed to prepare young readers for the death that was statistically likely to find them. Carroll demolished this tradition. He wrote a book in which the moral is that there is no moral. Lessons, the Griffin tells Alice, lesson from day to day. It was a revolutionary act of literary sabotage, the removal of instruction from a genre that had existed solely to instruct. And at the same time, Dodgson's Oxford was being torn apart by the Oxford movement, a high church revival that turned theological debate into academic warfare. Carroll satirized the rote religious education of his era by taking its most sacred texts, hymns like "How doth the little busy bee," and warping them into grotesque parodies. "How doth the little crocodile" is not nonsense. It is blasphemy, dressed as a nursery rhyme. Alice's recurring crisis, "Who in the world am I?" is the spiritual question of an entire generation watching Darwin's Origin of Species, published 3 years before the boat trip, dismantle the certainties their education was built upon. Act 6. The adaptations that revealed the truth. Every generation has remade Alice, and in doing so revealed what the original was hiding. Walt Disney's 1951 adaptation was an act of deliberate sanitization. Disney himself called Alice a cold character and complained that the film lacked heart. The Duchess's kitchen vanished entirely. The Jabberwocky was reduced to a deleted storyboard. What remained was color, music, and the systematic removal of everything that made the text dangerous. The Czech surrealist Jan Švankmajer saw what Disney refused to. His 1988 film used stop-motion animation built from taxidermy, bone, and old socks. His White Rabbit is a stuffed animal that leaks sawdust and must constantly stitch its own stomach shut. The entire film takes place in a claustrophobic room that, in Švankmajer's words, crawls around in your own head, a representation of childhood not as wonder, but as entrapment inside a world of rigid, incomprehensible adult rules. And then American McGee completed the deconstruction. His 2000 video game reimagined Alice as the sole survivor of a house fire that killed her family, incarcerated in a Victorian asylum, constructing Wonderland as a psychological defense against trauma. The game's levels map the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, with every character in Wonderland serving as a fragment of Alice's shattered psyche. It was the first major adaptation to say openly what the text had always implied: that Wonderland is not a place you visit. It is a place you retreat to when reality becomes unbearable. Act 7. The question the story won't answer. Modern scholarship has continued to peel back the layers. Phyllis Greenacre identified womb imagery in the rabbit hole and birth trauma in Alice's constant physical transformations, arguing that Dodgson's fixation on childhood was an unresolved dialogue with his own harrowing years at boarding school. Jacques Lacan read Alice's size changes as a metaphor for the struggle for agency in a world where language itself, the only tool we have for making sense of anything, is unreliable and precarious. Post-colonial scholars like Daniel Bivona have recast Alice as a colonizing force, a child who invades foreign territory and imposes British etiquette on its inhabitants, reading the Tea Party as an act of imperial occupation. But the question that none of these readings can resolve is the question of Dodgson himself. His defenders insist his friendships were conducted with parental permission, within the norms of his era, and that his behavior was, in the words of the biographer Edward Wakeling, entirely innocent in the sight of God. His critics, led by Morton N. Cohen and Will Self, argue that he was a heavily repressed man whose sexual energies were suppressed and diverted toward children, and that the razored diaries and burned letters are the evidence of a conscience that knew. The truth is in the pages that were cut out, in the letters that were burned, in the gap between the golden afternoon and the overcast sky. Alice Liddell lived to be 82 years old. She sold the original manuscript of Alice's Adventures Underground at auction in 1928 to fund her husband's death duties. She described Dodgson with fondness, with formality, and, eventually, with silence. The story he made of her followed her for her entire life, and she never once said publicly what she truly thought of the man who told it. And that silence, the silence of the real Alice, standing behind the fiction like a shadow behind a mirror, is the most disturbing truth of all. Because the story was never really about a Wonderland. It was about a man who built one for a child he could not stop thinking about. And whether that construction was an act of love or something else entirely is a question that the razored pages will never let us answer.